Okay, so now we're going to start off with week 5 Python. So we're going to start off with casting. So what is casting? So casting is when you change the data type of a particular variable. So if you have a 2, which is an integer, you might want to change it to a float, which is 2.0. And this is helpful for if you want to do math or if you're trying to display something in a certain way. And casting allows us to specify the types in a variable. So here's some examples of casting. If you cast 1 as an integer, it's going to be 1. If you cast 2.8 as an integer, what's going to happen is it's going to truncate everything past the decimal point. It's going to be 2. If you cast the string 3, it's going to recognize 3. It's going to cast it as an int. You can also cast numbers into strings. So if you have S1, which is a string, and you cast it to a string, it'll stay a string. If you have 2 and you cast it into a string, it'll stay 2, but it will be a string. And then 3.0, it will be the string 3.0. Floats, you can take an integer and then you can cast it to a float and it will be 1.0. A float that's 2.8, it'll stay 2.8, and so on. So this will be 1, this will be 2, this will be 3, this one will be 1.0, 2.8, this will be 3.0 because it's a float, and then this will remain 4.2. And here, x will be the string s1, this will be the string 2, and this will be the string 3.0. So here's a little activity you can try. Write a program that takes the input of a user and outputs whether it is an int or a float, and take into consideration which data type would be best suited to the input. So it's a little confusing. Explain really quickly what we're going to do. So this is the answer already, but what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if we're going to take a user input. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have num and we're going to set it equal to whatever the user input, and we're going to enter either an int or a float. And then we're going to check to see if it's an int or a float. And if it's an int, we're going to change it to a float. And if it's a float, we're going to change it to an int. So first, once we get the user input, we're going to want to check to see whether it's an int or a float. So this is a little bit confusing, so stick with me here. We're gonna, whatever the number is, we're gonna cast it to a float. So we're gonna have a decimal at the end. And then we're gonna do modulus 1 and we're gonna see if it's 0. And if it's 0, then that means it's in integers, because if you have, let's say if they entered in the number 3 and you turn that into a float, that'd be 3.0. And you take the modulus of 1, the leftover would be 0. But if they entered in 3.2 and you turn that into a float, it'd be 3.2. And then if you take the mod 1, if you divide 3.2 by 1 and you take the remainder, it'd be 0.2. It would not be 0. So if we take the float and we take the modulus of 1 and it's equal to 0, that's an integer. So we're going to cast it to a float. We're going to take another variable and we're going to set it equal to a float, and then parentheses, and then with the number inside, that's num. And then we have our else statement, and that's the other way. If it's a float, how do you change it to an int? So first you see that we change it to a float first, and that's because sometimes there'll be like round off errors like that, but we want to have it be a float so that way it's exact. So I'm going to run this and see, we put 7.2 and it enters 7, but if we get rid of the float, if we want to cast it to a float, it's one of those weird errors, and we run 7.2, enter it. It's going to give a little error. There's some issues. So when you cast a float to an int, sometimes you might want to cast it to a float before you cast it to an int. So, and then in the end, we printed it. Oops, I didn't type it there. 7.2, and then it works. And then if we take 7 and we type it, it stays let me run it again. We type 7, it turns 7.0. So that is the activity. Now we have string methods. Okay, so Fumi, do you want to do string methods? She just entered, so let's give some time.
Okay, so the next is string methods. What are string methods? String methods are a set of built-in methods in Python that can be used on strings. So then the syntax is an object, the method name, and then the argument and any other arguments. Common string methods are center, width has a argument of the width, returns a copy of S centered within the given number of columns. Another one is count, and it returns the number of an overlapping occurrence in a substring sub in S. Optional arguments start and end are interpreted as a slice in a slice notation. Another one is ends with, returns true if S ends with sub or false otherwise. Another one is find, which returns index in S where substring sub is found. Optional arguments at an end are interpreted as in slice notation. Another one is alpha, returns true if S contains only letters or false otherwise. And the last one is digit, returns true if S contains only digits, false otherwise. Okay, so 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 the next one is joint, which returns a string that it's in concatenation of the string in sequence. The separator between elements is S. Lower returns a copy of S converted to lowercase. Replace returns a copy of S with all occurrences of substring old replaced by new. If the optional argument count is given, only the first count occurrences are replaced. Split returns a list of words in S. Use seb as a delimiter string if seb is not specified as any white space string is a separator. Starts with, returns true if S starts with sub or false otherwise. Strip returns a copy of S with leading and trailing white spaces. Tab spaces, new lines removed. If a string is given, remove characters in a string instead. Upper returns a copy of S converted to uppercase. Do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so this is string indices. So if you have a string, each character in that string, including the spaces, are assigned a number. It starts off with 0. The first letter is going to be index 0, and then the next letter is going to be 1, and then so on and so forth. So if we have the string hello world with the space, H would be index 0, and E would be index 1, L would be index 2, and it'd go on. The space would be considered index 5, W would be index 6, and it would go on. You can also have a reversed index. So the last character would be -1, and then it would keep going negative as you go backwards. So D would be -1, L would be -2, R would be -3. And this is the negative indices are very useful if you're trying to get, let's say, the last letter of a string and you don't know the length of the string. So if you just said, oh, get me, if you have the string S, just get me S -2 or -1, you would get just D if your string was hello world. So it becomes useful if you want just the last letter or the last couple letters. The only thing you really need to remember and be careful about is the fact that each string, the first index is 0. So now we have an activity. This is more of like a playing around. So here's some things you should ask yourself and try to play around with. How would you test if a user answered a question correctly? If we want to think about this right now, you could try this on your own. If we were to think about it, you would want to ask the user a question and get an input, and then you'd want to have an if statement and check if the answer is if the answer that they inputted matches the correct answer. And I would suggest you check for like capitalization. So if your answer was yes, you might want to take both yes with a capital Y and yes with a lowercase y. So that's how you check that. Second thing you want to think about is inputting a question rather than a sentence. So think about how you do that. Format strings to look nicer in general. Really, you would want to think about spacing and indentation and things like that. And then challenge is find the average length of words given in a given sequence. So you'd want to, in this one, you'd want to split. You'd want to use the dot split function and or the method, and you would want to split each of the words using their spaces. So if we go back to our little count, there's s dot split, and then it returns the list of words in S. And then if the space, the spot where you want to split is not specified, it's going to use any white space as the splitter. So you'd want to use that, and you'd want to take all your words, and then you want to check the length of them, and then you'd want to find the average. So that's how you do that. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for coming.